Yesterday we discussed how this fraction is not in the simplified form. We're going to start with 6 over 1 minus I, and it's not in a simplified form. And the last example we had yesterday dealt with two complex numbers that had i's in them, but then all of a sudden we got a solid number. And what I need to do is I need to get rid of this square root of a negative 1 from the denominator. You cannot have a radical in the denominator, and this is technically a radical. So you've got to attack it in some way, and we call this method is, we're going to multiply by a form of 1 using the conjugate. If I wanted the conjugate of 4 minus 6i, I'm just going to switch the middle sign and put 4 plus 6i. I would multiply by a form of 4 plus 6i over 4 plus 6i. This is just an example of a conjugate. I look back at my problem. I need to get rid of this I in the denominator, and I'm going to use a conjugate in order to get me out of there. I've got to determine what is the conjugate of that denominator. It's 1 plus I. So I'm going to multiply by a form of 1. Here's what I mean by a form of 1. 2 divided by 2 is 1. 3 divided by 3 is 1. I divided by I is 1. So if 1 plus I is what I need to multiply by, then I'm going to multiply by 1 plus I over 1 plus I. That is a form of 1. I take numerator times numerator, divided by denominator times denominator. And it turns into yesterday where I need to simplify. Distribute. Thank you. Yes, that was a mistake. It should be plus 1. So the numerator now turns into 6 times 1 plus 6 times I. 6 plus 6i. Denominator, I'm going to have to double distribute. And we go through and simplify. I see that the i's are going to become 0. And I notice this special thing that I talked about yesterday. I squared is technically a negative 1. So we're left with 1 minus negative 1. But we know that that's going to turn into addition. So our final answer, 6 plus 6i over 2. Ooh, wait a second. That can't be my final answer. I notice everything is even. There's something about reducing. This can be rewritten as 6 divided by 2 over 6i divided by 2. So technically my final answer, 3 plus 3i. My apologies, answer up here. So if I get this on the ACT, I notice in my denominator, I've got a square root. This is a square root of a negative 1 in the denominator, and I've got to get rid of it. So I'm going to multiply by a form of 1 using the conjugate of that. So I'm going to multiply by 2 minus I on both the numerator and denominator. And you distribute. So it looks like we have 10i plus 5 all over 5. And I always need to recheck, wait, do they all have the same factor? And they actually do. They all share a factor of 5. So I'm going to take 10i divided by 5 plus 5 divided by 5. But notice how, wait a second, the imaginary part is going first, so technically be aware on an ACT they would actually have the answer written like 1 plus 2i. 2 minus 3i, all divided by 5i. Question is what is the conjugate? Negative 5i. I see positive 5i, and typically I do change the imaginary part. I see positive 5i, so I could multiply by negative 5i on top and bottom. I notice I don't have any like terms, but I do have these I squares I got to get rid of, or got to rewrite. I'm showing the step of putting in negative 1. Then you recheck. Do they all share the same factor? They are all a factor of 5, so I'm going to have to redo. Looks like we get negative 2i over 5 minus 3/5. But just make a note that on the standard form would be the real part first, negative 3/5 minus 2/5 I. Homework tonight is really practicing rationalizing. Practicing by multiplying by a conjugate. And then I'm challenging you about 92. I want to see 92 done before you leave.